Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Michael Hoffman, and he published a book recently titled Twilight Language. It's on Amazon. It has 21 five-star reviews now, but it's based upon a very influential book for me, which was published in April or May of 2001. The title of that book is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. And I quoted that book in my book, Children of the Beast, I think when I published Children of the Beast in 2014. So that original quote is on there. It's about the monolith that he wrote about in Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, which has 233 five-star reviews right now. Michael Hoffman is an independent scholar and the author of 10 books of history and literature, 3 of which have been published overseas in French and Japanese translations. He has studied political science and history under Faiz Abu Jaber at the State University of New York at Oswego and at Hobart College under Francis J.M. O'Loughlin. He's a former reporter for the New York Bureau of the Associated Press and is now the editor of the Revisionist History newsletter. And some of his other titles are The Occult Renaissance, Church of Rome, They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. And that's really been well read. There's many five-star reviews of that. I had not heard of that title. Another one is Usury in Christendom, the Mortal Sin That Was and Now Is Not. And then Adolf Hitler, Enemy of the German People. And again, we're going to talk about this book, which I have right here. He sent me a copy. I read through it, finished it today. Excellent book, Twilight Language, published 2021. So Michael Hoffman, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you for having me, William.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard your background or your earlier book, can you kind of just do an overview of your kind of independent research and leading up to Twilight Language, please?
Well, I am a former reporter for the Associated Press. That was way back in the 1980s, where I got a firsthand front row seat at the level of media bias. I often say that there is more falsification due to omission rather than commission. In other words, outright lies are rather easy to spot, and it's what they leave out that's often critical to our current inability to really parse and factor the landscape of lies. But also, I was fortunate in living in what I mentioned in the book Twilight Language. In fact, more than mentioned, there's actually a whole section on it. What the mainstream historians call the psychic highway or the burned over district. It was kind of the Big Sur or Berkeley, California area of the colonial and post-colonial United States in the 19th century and 18th century, 19th century, where a series of strange events and occurrences which affected American history and to a significant extent world history occurred along the 42nd degree line of north parallel latitude. As you know from reading my books and from the schooling I received from my mentor, James Shelby Downard, I've become very aware of what Mr. Downard called mystical toponymy and what happens both in terms of time as well as space. And so on the 42nd degree line, you had the founding of the Mormons, you had the founding of feminism, and you had several other very important world historic events and activities. One of them was a new religion, which is largely in decline now, but it was called spiritualism, and it involved contacting the dead, and it swept America. Everyone from the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison to Mary Todd Lincoln in the White House were holding seances. Many of us seem to think this was always more or less a commonplace part of the mythos of the occult, but actually it reached its pinnacle in the 19th century. And so there I was, born and raised in this area. And then I went to the State University of New York at Oswego, where I took a political science course with a Palestinian professor, Faiz Abu Jaber, who told me, he knew that I was an aspiring historian, and he told me, why are you looking into Napoleon or the French Revolution and Robespierre? Why don't you look in your own backyard, the psychic highway, the burned over district? And that's where I began to plumb the depths of my own locale, and the founding of the first major in world history opposition to Freemasonry, organized and institutionalized, also occurred in that burned over district psychic highway, along the 42nd degree of north parallel latitude. And that related to the kidnapping and murder of William Morgan, who wrote a book revealing the secrets of Freemasonry. And that book remains important to this day. He was kidnapped from the Ontario County Canandaigua jail and drowned in the Niagara River. And from that, particularly in the northeastern United States, arose a national movement opposed to Freemasonry. It's interesting to note that many members of Lincoln's cabinet, both his kitchen cabinet in the sense of an informal de facto cabinet, such as Thurlow Weed, and also his Secretary of State, William Seward, were very early on members of this anti-Masonic society and movement, which actually formed the first political convention, national political convention in the history of the U.S., nominating the Attorney General William Wirt as its presidential candidate. So this was fascinating to me. It was just up the road from my birthplace. And I did write a little pamphlet in 1978 called Masonic Assassination, and I grouped in Joseph Smith of the Mormons, who was indeed killed by a Masonic mob at the old Carthage jail. The Mormons rarely mention that in their tours or in their literature, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find some Mormon sources for that. I've used other sources besides the Mormons.
I think Smith gave a Masonic warning before he was killed, I think.
Yes, he said, "Will no one help the widow's son," which is the Masonic hailing of distress. But the Masons were tipped off ahead of time that he was a so-called apostate Mason. He would give the signal and they were to shoot anyway. So in his particular case, it didn't avail. But that's right. Very few people know that. And I also list, and this is speculative, I list Edgar Allan Poe as possibly having been victimized by the Masons. The story about him being a drunkard and that he simply collapsed in Baltimore during the campaigning season, I highly question. He was a prominent opponent of the Freemasons. And in fact, his short story, The Cask of Amontillado, is really an anti-Masonic story. So from there, it seemed like I was almost foreordained to be involved in this research after many detours and struggles in my own career as a writer, a journalist, and eventually a professional historian. But that's more or less how I got started. I would also throw Mr. Rod Serling into the mix. His summer home was in the Psychic Highway near the 42nd degree line of north parallel latitude, and I eventually got to know him. So Twilight language and the Twilight zone all involves the crepuscular, I suppose you could say.
Fascinating. Well, you met Rod Serling. I mean, he's so important, and that show is so influential and really has that Twilight morality, I think, that's reflected of your two books, Secret Society and Psychological Warfare. And this book, how would you spend time kind of defining Twilight language in the book? Can you share kind of what that represents, what that phrase represents?
Yes, surely. So Twilight language, what I'm talking about here is the address to the dreaming mind, not the unconscious, but the subconscious, the primordial Jungian archetypes of the subconscious psyche. And it's a time capsule that was and continues to be channeling from pharaonic Egypt the words of power, amuletic words which have an influence over us even when we don't realize it. And it's a ceremonial, transcendent processing of us. And what's unusual about it now, and what I mentioned in Twilight language is, in my book, Twilight Language, is that this phenomena is now for the first time in history public. It's gone public. The people who are behind it, what I call the cryptocracy, they don't care whether or not we know about it. Whereas before it was heavily shrouded in secrecy. The reason for that being that their solve et coagula alchemical process, in other words, break down and then rebuild according to their script, is well underway. And as a result of that, the revelation of the method, which is the next stage in terms of our bestialization and dehumanization, is well underway. And so what they feel is humanity in the West is in such tremendous decline that it doesn't matter if they reveal their crimes and their methodology to us. For us, it'll become simply part of the carnival sideshow funhouse, is what I call it, really, the fabulous double cross of His Satanic Majesty. And instead of us being angry about it and organizing about it, by and large, it becomes part of an entertainment network where we get a thrill from it. and then we become burned out, having so many adrenaline rushes that conspiracy theory itself, which I find to be largely unhelpful rather than helpful with some honorable exceptions, becomes a search for increasingly more powerful thrills. And so we're looking for the secrets behind the Las Vegas massacre of country and Western fans, or the secrets behind Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber. But once those secrets are revealed to us, what do we do with them? If we do nothing with them, if it simply empowers our apathy and our abulia, in other words, our loss of will, then we have descended down the ladder of consciousness, and we're worse off as a result of it. So these things are all what I've tried to factor into my book, Secret Society and Psychological Warfare, as well as Twilight Language.
Right. And you actually say in your book, like, because we're following along with that, we've also the population has been occulted to a certain extent. They've been absorbed into this process. And yes, I think that you're right.
Antonin Artaud, the famous French playwright and the forecaster of the theater of cruelty, as he called it, which is basically what our cinema and plays are today. He was the one who said that there would be a civic magic which would soon appear undisguised. And he was very prophetic in saying that, because he died in either the late 1940s or early 1950s. And that's what we have. We have a civic magic that's appeared undisguised. Arthur C. Clarke predicted the same thing in his 1950s novel Childhood's End, which features a literal Satan dressed in the livery of what we've come to associate stereotypically with the devil, walking in our midst after these interstellar vessels land on Earth. And after an initial panic and initial concern, people become accustomed to it, inured to it, and it's just another blip on the screen of, again, the decline. Evolution says we started out as simian creatures and are now ascending the evolutionary ladder toward the angelic. I actually believe the opposite. I believe we started out in an angelic state and we're descending into the simian, and I see examples of that every day.
Right, and I think your theme of the book is just to how humanity has changed under this cryptographical or cryptocracy assault of so many different events. I mean, you go back to JFK, and maybe you can talk, like, I'm not that familiar with James Shelby Downard, and you have a picture of him at the intro, and you guys wrote together that kind of really influential journalistic writing. Was it King Kill 33? You and him worked on that together, correct?
Yes, he sent me in the 1970s. He sent me a huge box of Xerox notes and his own thoughts and so forth, and then I distilled them into King Kill 33. And that was one of the first things when I first met Mr. Downard. One of the first things that really made me think that he was someone I had to know and know more about and befriend was his take on the Kennedy assassination, and where he saw Jack and Jackie as sex gods who descended to Love Field in the Angel airliner and proceeded to a Masonic temple site for the ritual sacrifice of the King of Camelot, witnessed by his queen of erotic sublimity, attended by the three unworthy craftsmen and the magic powerhouse of Oz in the form of Ruby, who didn't wear the slippers but did possess the ersatz jewels. A Jack Ruby in the jeweler's trade is a fake. And that's where we come into 9/11, the Black Jack 16+5 era, the Tower card and the Rider-Waite tarot deck being 16, and the Pentagon is 5, and that's where we saw the 9/11 attacks. 16 and 5, of course, is 21, and that becomes the Thanatos Threnody of our time. And so Mr. Downard was the first to alert me to that. He was the first to alert me to what he called, other people call it the atomic bomb. He called it the creation and destruction of primordial matter on the 33rd degree of north parallel latitude, at the place where the Jornada del Muerto, this ancient road of death, the journey of the dead man, literally in Spanish, ran into the White Sands missile site, dead on the 33rd degree line. And not far from the 33rd degree line, at the Triple Underpass and the Trinity River, John F. Kennedy had his appointment with destiny. So Mr. Downard's what he calls mystical toponymy, merging this nighttime highway of our psyche, mystical topography with crepuscular language, the inner landscape where time relations among events are assumed to be first constituted by the specific physical relations obtaining between them. I more or less extrapolated that from his own insight because he was very concerned with how the Kennedy administration had been labeled Camelot. And in Camelot, the concept is the once and future Camelot. T.H. White wrote a book about that, meaning always present. And so when you have this concept of time relations among events being first constituted by the physical space that they occupy, you can see the resonance of that. And that's what Mr. Downard was pointing to. And then later on, I had my own foray into the 42nd degree of north parallel latitude in terms of here is the space in time, but it remains in space. So it's there even as time passes. And this is part of the infinitesimally programmed ritual, which is intended to basically kill our minds and usher in the world foretold by the astrologer royal for Queen Elizabeth I, Dr. John Dee, when he forecast that we would be ruled by dead matter, which is in my view, shorthand for computers in the digital world. They're dead. They're not alive. It's interesting that the camel is said to be a questing beast. And, the root of the word Camelot, although many people have proposed different words for that, including Old English towns, Commendulum, and others. But the camel is derived via Latin and Greek, camelus in Latin, and camelois from the Hebrew gamal. And the Hebrew denotation of gamal is derived from the verbal root meaning repaying in kind. And I could go deeper into these things, but what I'm suggesting here is that if you've ever been to the Latin Tridentine Mass, which was derogated during the reign of Pope Paul VI, but I was a child at the time the Mass was going on. In fact, I was even an altar boy in the early 1960s. And you see, if for no other reason, watching the priest, every gesture that he makes has tremendous significance. How he even holds his fingers and where he stands. And that gave me an understanding of the importance of ritual, not just to the Catholic Church or even to the caricatured Black Mass, which is largely a product of Hollywood. I mean, there is such a thing, and there's even the Gnostic Mass, which is more accurate and more popular among occultists. But there is a Black Mass, but it's been horribly popularized and caricatured out of all form of what it originally intended. But the symbolic import of the Black Mass, or its exact opposite, the Tridentine Mass, is that gestures, rituals, and words process people. The Tridentine Latin Mass processed the pagan people of Europe, those robust Vikings, into pious Roman Catholics. How did it do that? Very few people have undertaken that study. And by the same token, an open air Black Mass, if you will, using Twilight language, using modern advertising techniques, using ritual murders placed along sites of significance, have acted in the general processing of humanity, and more specifically of those of us here in the cauldron of that alchemical process, the crucible of it, the American Southwest, and to a larger extent, the United States of America itself.
Yeah, it's just incredible. And you have, I think it's very apropos, is the abracadabra triangle right there at the intro to your book. And you have those things, like these words have power. So the words that are being used by the cryptocracy or things that are integrated into these events. And I think that the Camelot, Killing of the King, 33, Twilight language, and kind of like the psychosphere are overlap. I think that, so even today, I have all these guests on. We're still talking about the JFK assassination, and I'm actually talking to another one right after this about that event. So it's reverberated through generations. It's very powerful.
Yes, indeed. The problem for me with what's happened with the killing of our President Kennedy is that it's had an X-Files muddying of the waters where people propose 100 different solutions to the assassination of President Kennedy. I'm not proposing any solutions. I'm enamored of the epistemology of Charles Fort, and Fort didn't propose solutions. He studied mysteries and their effect on humanity and how humanity was being shepherded as a result of that. But in terms of proposing an overall systemic answer to things, I mean, I can give some answers to particular murder cases that I covered as a reporter in New York, but in terms of this overarching occult metaphysic, I think that that's probably too big for me to handle. And I wonder if other people are handling as well, because what we have in the conspiracy theory movement, and I don't consider myself part of it, is a kind of oracular gibberish. I've listened to some podcasts and programs where people have an encyclopedic recitation of various aspects of occult lore. And yet when the broadcast is concluded, I ask myself, what's the sum total of all of that tremendous knowledge and data that has been more or less recited? And my concern is to get to the root of these issues so that people will be armed against psychic manipulation in their lives, and watching, as you say, this parade of a mythos, the Kennedy assassination mythos, in the sense of that king, that glittering king, you know, probably the best looking president who's ever occupied the White House, and best looking first lady, and everything associated with it. And then this ceremonial murder of him, according to a killing of the king rite, which is well known among those who are students of the occult and of mythology. And so I'm interested in as precise a honing of that as we can get. And I'm very leery of just having the Kennedy assassination enter this general kind of popularization. I mentioned Love Field and the erotic aspect and the king kill aspect, but also Mr. Downard was keen on the three unworthy craftsmen, which in terms of rather mundane, and there's nothing wrong with it because they don't know any better, but the mundane researchers into the Kennedy killing talk about the three hobos that were arrested. And there's been a long debate about who they are. Is it E. Howard Hunt, and is it
Harrison?
Yeah. And so for me, that image transcends seeking out the identity. And this is what I'm trying to point people to. It's important to find out, if indeed we can, who those people were. But for Mr. Downard and myself, it's the symbolism of that, the mystery associated with these three individuals dressed shabbily, like most Americans are dressed today. Back then, that would draw attention. Today, that's how we go to the grocery store and the Walmart. But
church,
dressed in this manner, they're recreating a Masonic image. For those who know about the very important Masonic image of the three unworthy craftsmen who are supposed to be the assassins of Hiram of Tyre, who was the builder of the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, that can be dismissed as Hebrew or Old Testament mythology, but it's very important in Freemasonry. And whenever we see these images coming up, Masonic images, Kennedy was killed in Dealey Plaza, site of the first Masonic temple. Just like Mitre Square, has tremendous significance for British Freemasonry, was the site of some of the Jack the Ripper murders. These things have to be knitted together. And what I've tried to do is point things out that other researchers have missed, while not falling into the fever swamp that I think a lot of conspiracy theory represents, in which, as I say in my book, Twilight Language, I believe the cryptocracy actually is embedded inside conspiracy theory and uses a great deal of it for its own effects in terms of demoralizing us and in terms of spreading apathy. And what I should say is that as a Fortean epistemologist, I'd like to quote a key statement by Charles Fort, which many Forteans are aware of, and we often trade with one another. And it's this, quote, "Wise men have tried to understand our state of being by grasping at its stars or its arts or its economics. But if there's an underlying oneness of all things, it does not matter where we begin, whether with stars or laws of supply and demand or frogs or Napoleon Bonaparte. One measures a circle beginning anywhere." End quote from Charles Fort. And I think that the uses of measurement is what we're really fighting here. What yardstick do we apply to reality? What yardstick are we applying to the assassination of JFK? Is it one limited by empirical history and research alone? Or should we be using the yardstick of the cryptocracy itself that is the string puller and puppet master behind many of these events? So I realize that some people will think that my research is so off the wall, but it's in keeping with this Fortean epistemology. Mr. Downard, it was Adam Parfrey of Farrell House Press that brought this up. Mr. Downard gives us a sense of wonder when he opened up the doors of perception in this particular way to see that there's so much more involved in what our adversaries would like us to limit to current events and the news of the day. And there's so much more behind it. It is a world of wonder, but unfortunately, it can be a very macabre or indeed even malignant one.
And I think those three, it was Jews, it's a Juwes, right? The three unworthy.
The Jewes, yes.
Jewes. And they were led into the Masonic temple. So they were paraded out by the cops, walked, no handcuffs, and right into the Masonic temple is my understanding.
And then I don't know about being marched into a Masonic temple, but I do know that their identity was lost. The records are it's like with the Manson case, the book Chaos I recommend it. And I just reviewed it in our Revisionist History newsletter. And there,
I interviewed O'Neill. Yeah, O'Neill's.
Yeah, and O'Neill's done some really good work, hard work, what they would call in French, la travail de Benedictine here. And one of the things he points out is, most of the records are gone. And this is, Charlie Manson's case has almost the same mythological status in American pop culture as the JFK killing, even though I believe that the JFK killing, like the creation and destruction of primordial matter, the landing on the moon, I know some people believe we didn't go there. I believe we did. At least some of the flights were authentic. And then 9/11. For me, those are absolute key changes in our perception and in the history of the world and where we're headed. But certainly Manson is an important footnote to that. And as Mr. O'Neill points out over and over in his book, when he went to look for the records, whether it's the court records of the very important Susan Atkins' very first statements before she had been tutored by her mob lawyer. She originally had an honest lawyer at first. He was pushed out of the picture. And that first court hearing where her statement was entered into the record, that's gone. Records of Manson's early years, 67 and 68, in San Francisco Bay Area, where his parole officer dispatched this guy who'd been locked up in prison, probably, was a 60s guy, 1950s guy, nothing like the Manson that would be recast in terms of the psychological warfare that was used against him by the CIA and so forth. So, yeah, the paper trail they like to get a hold of and destroy as quickly as they can. And so that part of research is very important. I mean, I was in Lincoln, Montana, just almost immediately after Ted Kaczynski was arrested in the so-called university and airline bombing, or what the FBI termed it in a kind of Twilight language word, Unabomb. And of course, there's now a ridiculous Hollywood movie completely muddying the waters, like Bulosi did with Helter Skelter, and then the resulting movie.
Right.
And Ted Kaczynski, he committed some of those atrocities. Yes, not all of them. The FBI was deeply involved in shepherding Ted Kaczynski. I have evidence of that. I was on the scene. I talked to his neighbors. This was before the mainstream media really got it going. And I was also able to make contact with Kaczynski when he was in the local jail there in Helena. He wanted me to visit him, and I was blocked by his federally appointed federal defense attorney. Wow. And he lived, again, bringing up the mystical toponymy element, he lived in the Scapegoat Wilderness, not far from the Scapegoat Cafe. And if there ever was a scapegoat, it's Theodore Kaczynski, PhD, who was subjected to LSD so-called research connected with Harvard University. So we go down and down this rabbit trail.
By a very well-known spook psychologist, right? I forgot his name offhand, but that guy was working with Leary too, who was also working with Kaczynski at the time, right? And
another spook psychiatrist, as you term it, appropriately, working with Manson out of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, so-called.
Jolly and West, I think. Was that?
Yeah, West. Right. That's right. Yep.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. So you've had these contacts. Also, you went and visited Charles Harrelson, who got arrested for killing a federal judge too, right?
I tried to. That was the key. I went to his son, the actor Woody Harrelson, and I was at a restaurant with him in San Francisco, and what my goal is to, Woody had said, he had alerted me. He said, my father's a CIA agent. And, gee, a mafia hitman is a CIA agent, and there's a lot that he wanted to say and he couldn't. And I thought that, here's the opportunity, because none of these people, none of the perpetrators of these high profile Twilight Zone type of killings, such as the assassination of President Kennedy and so forth, have ever been brought to justice, which is why it's so easy for the cryptocracy to recruit people to commit these crimes, because of this veritable immunity. And so it was my goal to get into Charles Harrelson. He was still alive at the time. He was in prison serving a life sentence, and having his son recommend me. Well, that didn't go well at all. I admit I was too abrupt. I basically just, gave him both barrels instead of slowly working up in the course of our conversation. He and I had a mutual friend in Hawaii. He wanted to discuss the mutual friend. I wanted to discuss his father. And I rather abruptly confronted him with, did your father kill President Kennedy? And I wanted to go from there and to having him understand that since I was 12 years old, I have been deeply and profoundly concerned with the killing of the king in Dealey Plaza. And I would be the guy who would see this all the way to the end. And he started crying. And I don't want to mention any names here. I'll just say the woman that he was with intervened then and felt that I was ruining his day. And that was the end of that. So I did the best that I could with the resources that I had. I'm surprised that other better positioned journalists and researchers weren't successful there, and why Woody wouldn't have been the gateway to grant that, if indeed his father would have cooperated. But I don't see what his father had to lose, unless, of course, the family is threatened. It's same thing with McVeigh, with the Oklahoma City bombing, and to a lesser extent with Kaczynski. The cryptocracy will, if you yourself are fearless, you're willing to go ahead. Quite often the cryptocracy, in order to buy your silence, and some silence is still necessary even in this revelation of the method era, they will threaten, often indirectly, hint at threatening your mother, your girlfriend, your daughter, your sister, whomever. And I definitely think that could have been a factor for Woody's reluctance, although I'm not going to speculate because I don't know. But where's the rest of the media on this, in getting to perhaps the last key person involved profoundly, if indeed he was, with the Kennedy assassination? So things like this. Of course, we have one of the most corrupt medias of mass communication on earth, and that's a big part of our problem here in the United States today.
And I think Charles Harrelson at one point implicated himself and then retracted it. And there used to be that all over the internet. There used to be, well, those interviews were on YouTube and they've all been taken down. I don't know what happened to them. But yeah, so that's an interesting side story. I mean, you said in your book you were friends with, or a co-writer with, Jim Keith, right? Who somehow, can you
not a co-writer. I respected Jim and he respected me. I liked his book Secret and Suppressed. And I also like the fact that he was on the trail of Robert K.G. Temple, who wrote the book The Serious Mystery. 1977 was an interesting year, and one of the lots of important books came out that year, including Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, and then the 1977 was really a key year, and so. Robert K.G. Temple's book, The Serious Mystery, was published in 1977, and he did a tour of the United States on radio. There weren't podcasts at that time. And Jim intervened. He got on the air with him as a caller, I guess, and he took some of my first pages of my book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, which more or less excoriates Robert K.G. Temple, not for the revelations he made about how the star system Sirius is at the heart of Pharaonic Egypt's cosmology, and also that of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, which is the most powerful branch of Freemasonry in the world, but also the fact that Temple was talking about this utopian type of hippie paganism, which was so far superior to the church and Christianity. And what I point out in Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare is that actually it's a hidden church, far more disciplined and far more inquisitorial and demanding of obedience than even the old Catholic Church was. And I gave Jim a lot of credit for actually confronting Temple with that. And Temple mumbled some type of gibberish and moved on. But also Jim's death, I mean, very mysterious at Burning Man. And, you know, Burning Man is fairly important for recreating the figure that was popularized in the movie The Wicker Man. And of course,
which
the
you
word
talk about in this book often. You reference the Wicker.
Yeah. And the word wicker is a key Twilight language word. And so Jim had a broken leg. I mean, this is all secondhand, but Jim had somehow was injured with a broken leg at Burning Man and then died in the hospital there locally, whatever the nearest hospital was. I grant you it was ways away, but this didn't involve arterial bleeding. How do you die of a broken leg? And to the best of my knowledge, he didn't have any other ailments. So I wonder, you know, what that was. But yeah, Jim was a good guy. And in many ways, Adam Parfrey was important for having, I turned over King Kill 33 to him for publication in his book, Apocalypse Culture, which was a bestseller and really helped to spread James Shelby Downard's information.
Right. And Parfrey recently passed away too. So yeah, that's
yeah, he had very severe diabetes. You know, he had a shunt in his brain from a concussion. Yeah, that was tragic. He died the same age as his character actor father, Woody Parfrey, who was a wonderful actor.
Yeah, he was the guy selling snake oil in The Outlaw Josie Wales was Parfrey's dad.
Yeah, the Grudge in the 8 movies, and also in Papillon, and quite a guy. Yeah, Adam had a whole fund of anecdotes about Hollywood, and his father wasn't really that high on other actors. I can tell you that.
Oh, interesting. I mean, and then you kind of, I mean, you know about the heart, like all these strange shootings, Harvest Festival, DC Sniper, Holmes Aurora, Virginia Tech. There's something very, very strange going on behind a lot of these shootings, and Kaczynski too, right?
Yeah, it's just wearing us out. It really is. I mean, the American people are aware of these things in the back of their mind, and that's why I'm starting to see this shabbiness. I'm always looking for signs of psychological deterioration. And I even noticed at the State of the Union address, Mr. Biden's recent State of the Union address, where I saw, not to disrespect the ladies that were there, I'm sure some of them were dressed very well. Amy Coney Barrett from the Supreme Court was well dressed, but some of the other ladies, they're dressed in this kind of rude polyester, shabby clothing. I just see a decline everywhere, including in the livery of humanity in terms of these things. And I'll give you, if you'll indulge me, a brief passage from Twilight language on page 49. Perhaps this will be maybe the best encapsulation I can give you in the time remaining. It's subtitled "The Fabulous Double Cross of His Satanic Majesty." A familiar pattern in the revelation of the method is to leak bits and pieces of evidence of criminal conspiracy and then ensure that the perpetrator gives vague answers or talks around the subject, as George W. Bush did. The goal of the revelation is to desensitize Americans to the fact of Bush's complicity in 9/11 by exposing them to an intermittent, occasionally dramatic, but mostly low-level buzz. By this conditioning process, awareness of Bush's connivance gradually becomes absorbed into the din of what I call the process, morphing into the substrata of the digital psychedelic funhouse. The slowly dawning revelation of Bush's treason becomes not a basis for indictment and prosecution, but a sideshow for the game zone's sarcastic management simulator, a macabre yet perversely sexy rumor mill that burnishes Bush's potency and aura and plays on the people's jaded sense of awe in the presence of a satanic majesty who commands such power that he can successfully mount a fabulous double cross and still thrive. And so it's a sense of like, wow, there's this power and we're in awe of it, even behind our sort of front story that we're seeking to bring these perpetrators to justice. But I think our spirit and our mind has been so harmed and damaged by knowing that these weird crimes, and you gave a brief inventory of them, have been happening with no one being brought to justice. And there's a sense, just like the majority of Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as his own son Bobby has courageously set forth, but also in these other so-called serial murders and crimes, that there is a tremendous evil inside the federal government and operating with the cooperation of elites in America, including the executives of the major media outlets, and yet nothing is being done. And so it becomes grist for this entertainment mill, and that is mind killing and soul killing. And that's basically one of the major themes of my books.
Right. Yeah, it's very well said, very well written too. Michael, we're at about the 40-minute mark. Do you mind taking a few questions? I've got a number of questions from people.
Certainly, sir.
Oswald Spangler asked, does Hoffman think the resurgence of interest in Kaczynski's writings has been organic?
I think so, in a sense, because Adam Parfrey was in touch with Dr. Kaczynski and published a lot of his writing. And also, I believe from Feral House, there's a whole book of Kaczynski's writing. I've tried to go through it, and I find it turgid and sort of self-evident. I mean, we know that the planet is under attack by predatory capitalism. But I don't think that the way to go about it is with terrorist methods or with shutting down Western civilization. I mean, we should have the innovative talent and inventiveness to do it without completely shuttering our civilization. In fact, I don't even think it would be completely shuttered. I think that you would find, as certain movies are now implanting in our minds, the notion that there would be islands of repose and Edenic sections that would be reserved for the plutocrats and the politically connected, and they would have all the modern conveniences and energy, and the rest of humanity would be reduced to this virtual subhuman level. So as far as the notion that it's forced, I don't think so, but I don't think that the cryptocracy has any objection to circulating his manuscripts, because they're written in such a tone that I don't think it really is much of a recruiting piece. And also, since they themselves know that they were partly responsible for the terrorism that was unleashed under Unabomber. I'll give you one example. I don't mean to be cryptic here deliberately. They never searched for any accomplices in the Unabomber case. I know that for a fact. If I were called to testify, I would provide more of the information. And the reason I'm not going into it now is because we have limited time and I couldn't do justice to it. But I can tell you, as an eyewitness to that they didn't search for other accomplices. They knew from the beginning that it was only Ted and the secret government inside the federal government that was responsible. And Ted Kaczynski did not commit all of those killings. So to answer the question, I don't think they're much worried about the text, because that's not the whole story by any means of Unabomber.
So they did some of the, you saying the government did some of the bombs that are attributed to Kaczynski, or the cryptocracy did it?
Government agents were surveilling Kaczynski almost the entire time that Unabomber was going on. I believe that he had been marked out for something like this ever since his Harvard days. Don't forget, there's a notion that a lot of this recruiting goes on in psychiatric centers where certain psychiatrists, and you and I have noted earlier that the MK Ultra program involved a number of psychiatrists in key positions, often very elite, and they look for people who fit a profile, not just in psychiatric centers, but also brilliant people in some of the leading universities. And I think that Kaczynski was one of them who was planted that way, and Manson at the other end, maybe of the cerebral scale, but nonetheless, in terms of charisma, was also spotted in that way. But yes, I believe that assets of the federal government unquestionably were some of the ones who perpetrated what was ascribed to Kaczynski. Don't forget, Kaczynski, like David Berkowitz and Son of Sam, like the putative killer of Martin Luther King and others, these guys have no trials. Okay, Kaczynski was medicated at the last time he appeared in front of a judge. He was under medication. Now, someone can say, well, the judge asked him whether he was under medication right now. Yes, that's true. But he didn't ask him whether he'd been medicated 24 hours before that. And as we know, heavy medication stays in your bloodstream. So it was an interesting loophole that they created. But yes, he was under the influence of psychotropic drugs, and he never really defended himself. He didn't have the attorney that he wanted. He wasn't allowed to talk to me. His federal defense attorney obstructed that. And we see this down the line. So yes, absolutely, there was no search for his accomplices, any possible accomplices, because they knew who did it. And they could have gone over, for example, to the University of Montana in Missoula, which was not far from where Kaczynski was in Lincoln, where they have a very active environmental group. I'm not saying that they're radicals or terrorists. There was no real earnest search over there. There was no authentic search for accomplices in the Kaczynski case. And for me, that pretty much says it all.
Says it right. And you actually include that in the DC sniper case. There was a federal woman who somehow got shot too. That makes that whole thing really suspicious, and all the occult elements there. It's really just an incredible, like, what's going on in this country. I mean, Lee Veltman asks, what are your thoughts on behavior modification and coercion, and how hard or easy is it to use social engineering on the mass population? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's what our media is today. I mean, it's an open air social engineering is basically what it is. Look at how, I'm going to step on some toes here, and I don't hope you don't get banned, but look at how a fundamental premise of biology, which is indisputable, that this person has XX chromosomes and this person has XY. And each delineation there is what denotes whether you're a man or a woman, okay? And now we're told that someone with XX chromosomes is not what that indicates, but they are of the opposite sex. And so this is such an absurd assault on reality, yet like with the emperor who has no clothes, we're not allowed to say that he has no clothes. It takes a childlike mind to step up and say the emperor has no clothes, a childlike innocence to step up and say, well, an XX chromosome in one person has to distinguish that person from an XY chromosome. We've lost that level of reality, and that's an indication of how far we have been processed. And the processing goes on in the Academy Award ceremonies. I know that my friends in the Nation of Islam, the Black Muslims, have taken tremendous objection to seeing black guy, the last Academy Award, a black man was there in a huge dress. Maybe some people feel that's fine. Okay, the Nation of Islam didn't. They wondered why a black man was being used to put forth this androgynous image, which is very central to the Alchemical Change Agency, which I mentioned in my book. In talking, and I go right into the early Rosicrucian order and the symbolism connected with that, as the occult moved through originally the Medici and the Catholic Church in Florence and in Rome in the 15th and 16th centuries, and then moved into Protestant circles, and then from Rosicrucianism became Freemasonry. But that type of processing used to be limited to those who entered the lodge and went through the initiatory steps. Now it's an open air initiation using the media of mass communication. So you won't see the Amish being that heavily processed, and you won't see other people who live lives off the grid in that particular way. You really have to be tied into the data hive in order to get the processing. And so MK Ultra is now right out in the open, embedded in our movies and television and, of course, the internet and video games and virtual reality, as it's called.
So true. And you use that term throughout your book, capital P process. It reminded me of the process Church of the Final Judgment, like that process of going towards the apocalypse or something like that. One more question from Lee Hilldoggy. He asks, what does Michael recommend we do to counter this cryptocracy?
Well, of course, I'm a Christian. And, for me, I turn to the book of Romans, chapter 7, the middle part around Romans 7:10. and continuing on into chapter 8, into the middle of that chapter. And that's where the Apostle Paul himself confronts it's an amazing part of the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul is confronting his own sins and transgressions, even though he is reputed, and indeed I believe he is, the greatest Christian missionary of all time. And yet he was still wrestling not only with shortcomings, but unmentioned sins that he was. And the basic answer to that is, if you claim Christ as your Savior, if you believe that he died on the cross for your sins, and that he rose again and defeated death, you are part of God's people. And I think that one of the problems that we're enduring today is that that's really been betrayed, and that awareness has been betrayed. Now, I know about what was done to the American Indians in the name of Christ. And I'm very well aware of how Christ has been misapplied, but also that doesn't take away from the origin of it. The prevailing digital ethos is extinguishing our humanity by causing us to renege the covenant, a nation and a people predestined by God to good things, to being shepherds of this earth, for example. Instead of building house upon house and Californicating all of the land, giving space for humanity to develop. What about usury? What about the renting of money? That was a mortal sin, a sin that could condemn you to hell. And then the Catholic Church fell in, beginning in the 16th century, for situation ethics. It spread to Protestantism. And now any Christian in good standing, and the vast majority of the churches in the world, can rent money, meaning usury, at any rate of interest. It doesn't matter whether it's 1% or 100%. Otherwise, if you tell me that prostitution is bad only if you paid $1,000 for it, but if you got it at a cut rate, it isn't. This is all the wages of situation ethics. So for me, it's in Christ, but it's the true Christ. And I think there's been a whole campaign of deception based on TV preachers and all of these profoundly immoral, greedy people who in the name of, and violent people and warmongering people who in the name of Jesus have pushed people away from the gospel. And so for me, it remains that's the gospel hope, which is the key of my own hope. And also having families and not buying into the environmental propaganda that we shouldn't have children. I mean, those who are most environmentally aware should be the ones who are having the most children. But once you stop having children, decide not to have them, then that's really the terminus of your future. And that's what we're seeing for Western civilization. And it's a very perilous attitude. I'm a strong campaigner for human rights for unborn human beings, and the dehumanization of the child in the womb is a central part of the black magic which afflicts us in this time.
Well, that's a great way to finish it, Mike. And where's the best place for people to get Twilight language?
Well, there's a number of outlets, but the best one would be www.revisionisthistory.org, which is our website. And we have a secure online ordering, and we can process those orders. And yeah, that would be fine. Appreciate it.
And you can get your other books. You can get them both. You can get these two that you can read back to back. I highly recommend Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, one of the most influential books I've read. So you could get that and Twilight language from your website at Revisionist History too, signed if they'd like, I assume.
Yes, revisionisthistory.org. Even though we own the trademark on those words, another person runs a revisionist history podcast, which the establishment is behind. So if you try to search for us under revisionist history, you won't find us until the 20th page on Google. It didn't used to be that way, but they pushed us way down. So revisionisthistory.org. And thank you, William, for that plug.
Awesome. Revisionisthistory.org. I will put that in the show notes so people can just click on that and click through to that. And really great talk. And it's great to have you on. And for somebody who's influenced me so much, it's really an honor for me to interview you. So thank you so much. And congratulations on the book. Great book. Title again is Twilight Language, published 2021. You can find it on Amazon. Author is Michael Hoffman. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
All right, take care. All right, stay there.